Hello everyone. In this tutorial, I will be showcasing how to unwrap UVs when we encounter difficult to map geometry. So in this case, I want to complete the mapping of the front of the fuselage of the Viper. And as you can see, when I orbit this around, the tail end has already been mapped. So it leaves me with this portion to map it out. So let me go ahead and select that geometry and hide everything else so that I have a cleaner workspace. So with that selected, I'll go Display, Hide unselected, or Alt-H will hide everything. That's the shortcut. Now, if you notice, now I have just the portion that I want to map out. Let me double check on my attribute editor that I actually have a material applied to it, and I have the initial material applied to that. And let me double check as well that I have UV mapping applied to this. So when I go to the UV dropdown, remember to access the UV dropdown, you need to be under the modeling mode. So let me go ahead and go to UV editor and I'll open that up. And as you can see with this selected, I don't see any UV mapping shells on the first quadrant. Therefore, this has no mapping applied to it. So I need to have some sort of mapping applied to it in order to start cutting pieces off. Let me go ahead and lodge this right here on the right hand side so that I have everything open, and collapse my attribute editor so that I can see both things. So with that done, let me go ahead and with that selected, I'm going to apply a planar map. Remember, it doesn't matter what type of mapping you apply to start with. I prefer to start always with planar mapping because it makes my life easier. So I'll go ahead under Create and choose either planar mapping, or go under UV and choose planar mapping. Both workflows will take you to the same end result. So I'll go ahead and create planar mapping options, and I'm going to make sure that I'm looking at this from my camera or from any axis. It really doesn't matter. You're going to be cutting it into pieces anyway. So the end result is not going to be that planar map. You're just basically using that as your base mapping to start working with to create the shells. So I'll go ahead and project, and as you can see, it projects the exact same thing. Like I said, this map is useless to us to map, but it is the initial point for what we want to do to that, how we want to cut those UVs, how we want to unwrap them. So let me go ahead and expand this really quick so that I can start working on this portion of the UV mapping. So to do so, I am going to right click the object and go to Edge Mode, and I am going to be separating this into 1, 2, 3, 4 shells. So this portion back here will be one shell. The cylindrical inner part of the front of the engine will be, the ship will be also another shell. The actual wraparound portion, this whole thing, will be one shell. And the back of the model will be another shell. So let's go ahead and get situated so that I can actually get in there, get as close as possible, and look at the edges that I want to, through which I want to create the cuts. So to create those cuts, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and go to UV, 3D Cut and Sort UV tool. Now this you find, like I said, under the UV drop-down, or you have a shortcut in your shell for poly modeling all the way to the right-hand side is this one over here. So I will be using this one from now on, but know that you have access to it basically from the drop-down for UVs. So in order to start cutting, what you want to do is you start clicking, and you can control click if you wanted to start basically setting all that up, or you can take advantage of the shortcut by pressing the tab key. And when you press the tab key on your keyboard and keep it pressed, you'll see that it highlights the loops through which you can cut. So I want to cut that loop right there. Remember, pressing the tab key, keep it pressed, move around into the different edge loops, and you'll see where you want to cut. Click on that, and that creates a new cut. And as you can see, the color of that shell changed. So that's the first cut I want to do. The second cut will be right on this edge loop out here. And if I press tab on that, keep it pressed and click tab, click on it, then it cuts. And yeah, I can tell that it cut because it changed the color of the inner portion of this. Since I want that cylindrical area to map out nicely like a piece of paper, to unwrap like a piece of paper, I also want to create a cut right at the bottom of this right here. So let me press tab and click on that, and that creates a nice clean cut right there, so that when this unwraps, this whole area unwraps, it will unwrap like a flat piece of paper nicely. Then let me go to the back portion of the ship, and I'm going to choose one of these loops right here, press tab, and I'll probably use this one right here, or this one. Press tab, keep it pressed so that I have the entire loop selected, and as you can see when I cut, that changing color indicates that I am creating a new shell. Now, the last thing I want to do is I want to unwrap the center portion, this whole area here, the purple portion. And to do so, I am going to the bottom of this. I am going to use the center edge loop, or this center loop, to this center line of edges to actually do what I want to do, that unwrapping. So I'm going to press tab, and as I move close to them, they get unwrapped, they get selected, and then when I click on them, they get unwrapped. So now I have the shells. I can tell on my UV editor that things have been cut. As you can see, there's the inner portion, there's that shell, there's the outer portion, and then there's the back. So I can now go ahead and right click in my viewport, go to component, and start selecting the UV shells to unwrap each of them. So I'll select, once again, right click on the model, go to component, and shell. Now, the reason why I right click and I don't see my regular flyout menu is because, remember, I am still under the cut and sew tool. Okay, so if I'm under that tool, remember that's a sticky tool, so it still remembers that I am in it, and I want to stay in it while I'm doing this. So when I right click, I'm seeing the flyout menu that is specific to that particular tool. I'll go to component, UV shell, and as I select the different shells, you'll notice that as I roll over them, they get highlighted. So I'm gonna go ahead and select the first one here, the outer one, and I will press the D key on the keyboard. D as in dice. When I do that, the computer thinks for a second and it unwraps the geometry for me. Let me go ahead and continue doing that for each one of the shells that I was working on. So now I'll go to cylinder, press D, and that gets unwrapped. Then the one in the back here of the engine, of the front of the ship, sorry. That's another one. And turn around, select the back portion, press D. So everything has been unwrapped for this particular geometry, making it easier for me to go ahead and export these UV maps to Photoshop or to a image editing program, and going ahead and setting up the artwork to map into this particular geometry. So with this done, what I want to do is I want to organize my UV mapping, my shells, sorry, on my UV editor. So let me go ahead and select out of this, exit the tool, and then with that, right click, click object mode, go back to my UV editor and select UV shells, and we can now go ahead and use the W key to start to call the move tool and start moving things around so that I organize my workspace. As you can see, this is fine. They unwrap fairly clean, but they're all over the place. I mean, they're rotated and the sizing is off. There are several things that we need to fix on this. So first things first, this will be my base geometry. This is what I'm going to use as my reference for everything else, that portion. And that's because that's the most visible part of the fuselage. So I will spend most of my time working on this, and everything else should follow what I do to that. So first things first, let me go ahead and rotate this, pressing the E key and rotating ever so slightly so that I make it as horizontal as possible. Let me bring it back into the 0 to 1 quadrant, which is this one. Remember, that's where we will be creating any map that we bring in will be in that quadrant, and it would be a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you create your maps, make sure that they're square. Let me go ahead and focus on this. And with that setup, I am going to go ahead and right, it's still a little bit off, so I want to make sure that I straighten it out. So let me go ahead and right click on that and go to edge. Then I'll double click the edge loop that is roughly in the center of that shell, and I can go ahead and shift right click to go straighten shell, or you can find that as well. Let me do it that way, or you can find that option as well under your menus under UV Toolkit. So if you go to unfold drop down, you find they have straighten UVs and straighten shells. So if I click on straighten shell here, based on that selection, let me go ahead and double click that to select the edge. Click on straighten shell, you'll notice that it does the exact same thing. It sort of balances that particular, that edge to be either vertical or horizontal, depending on what it is closest to at the moment. Right now, it was closest to being horizontal, so that's why it straightened out that shell that way. Let me right-click, go back to UV shell, and place it so that I am not mapping outside of my quadrant. So with that done, what I want to do is I want to have everything else. Let me actually straighten out this one as well really quick. I want to make sure that my quadrants are that everything is sized, like I said before, based on that original of this one, the first piece of the fuselage. So let me straighten that shell for this. That's straightened out. Well, it's not that good, but that works. Let me go ahead and right-click, go to shell. And so what I want to do is I want to grab the sizing of this, the textile density of this particular piece, and then make everything else follow that textile density. Remember, textile density refers to how the amount of pixels that are being placed around each one of the UV points within my mesh, within that shell. So to do that, I need to select the one that I want to capture, which is this one. And then I'll go under my UV toolkit, go to transform, scroll down all the way to textile density and click get. That gives you a value. This value, it's saved in memory for now. Then I can go ahead and click on the other shells, shift click to select them all, and then I'll say set. And you'll see that those will be resized. They will get smaller because that is now in comparison to the size of this UV shell. That's the size those items should be to balance out, to make sure that the ratio is the same as this one when it comes to textile density. With that set up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift select this guy so that I have all of them selected, all of the shells. And then I'm going to go down on the same menu under UV toolkit. I am going to arrange layout, and at the bottom, find layout, click, and it will just go ahead and wrap everything into that one quadrant. So that works out fairly well. Now, the way I really want, and this is by the way, this is done, the computer selects what's the best positioning for items within that quadrant so that it fits, so that when you map out, everything is in one single spot. Now with this done, what I want to do is I had created some artwork for this, and as you can see, I have some stuff ready in Photoshop, including my face mapping for color and bump mapping, which is black and white lines. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and let me go back to Maya. I want to, with what I just saw a second ago, I want to make sure that my fuselage is somewhere around here, and then that this is here. Now I can just go ahead and simply at this moment import that map and apply it to that object. So what I want to do is I want to take advantage of my standard surface mapping from Arnold. So I'll go ahead and right click on the object, assign a new material, go to the shader, and go to the standard surface mapping. That's been applied to that particular model. And I'll go ahead into my attributes editor, scroll all the way to the right so that I get access to the actual standard surface material. And I am going to its color for the base option. I'm going to go into color. I'm going to click file, and I am going to browse for the file that will be the texture for the fuselage. So that's the first thing I add in there. And as you can see, it appears in my UV editor. Now I can start organizing my UV editor. Let me close this guy and let me close my attribute editor for a second. I can start organizing my shells so that they actually fit where they should go. So let me get this one out of the way really quick. And let me go ahead and move this out of the way as well. Let me grab this guy and move it up here so that it matches, roughly matches the positioning of that artwork. And I think that works fairly well. Might need to make it slightly smaller, so let me reduce it in size just a tad. And I'm using, as you can see, I'm using the red line as the guides for the center of the ship. So I need to place that roughly in the center. There you go. Let me see what that's looking like. That's looking pretty good. Just reduce it ever so slightly and move this forward just a tad. Okay, this is the back of the ship, and that shell is going to be just the gray, so I can just go ahead and move this to this area here. Okay, and both the center and the back of the front of the engine and the cylinder will be this black area here. So I'm not looking for a lot of detail in that area, so I can go ahead and map out this fairly quick by simply placing and resizing. And I can even overlap the maps if I want to, because it will be unnoticeable in that portion. The camera will never be inside that area, so there is no foul on overlapping some of the maps, since it's all going to be all dark in there anyway. So with that done, let's go ahead and right click on the object here in my viewport, go to object mode, deselect it, and make sure that your shading hardware texturing is activated. And as you can see, now we have mapped out this object. Now let me select it again, and that works just fine. It looks a little plasticky, and if I do a quick render, let me go ahead and select this display show all so that I can see the entire geometry. It's a little bit plasticky compared to the one in the back, and there's a reason for that. Let me do a quick IPR to see what we have going on here. And while it renders it, you'll see that basically now it looks fairly good compared to, I mean, once balanced out with the back. However, it's plasticky. It's pretty straightforward. It's too smooth. So we want to make use of the bump mapping to go ahead and enhance some of the features on that ship. So let me go ahead and close this out and take advantage of that bump map. So I'll go ahead and open up the attribute editor, and under the material for that object, the AI standard surface, let me scroll down to my geometry. And under geometry, I will click on bump mapping, click the map to load the file that I had created for that. And then under bump value, go to that mapping option, and under image name, load the face bump texture. So now let's take a look to see what this looks like on the viewport. And as you can see, it's in fact, it has it mapped, but it's all backwards. So we want to make some changes to that. To get access to how the bump map has been projected onto the geometry, we'll go ahead and click on this little icon right here, which takes you one level up, back again to where you control the bump mapping. And let me go ahead and start playing around with these values. Now, as I can see, this is almost like it's sticking out. If you can see, it seems to be sticking out, and we want it to actually indent, so that this is a value of 1. Therefore, it follows that if I do a -1, it should move it in the other direction. And as you can see, it does go ahead and indent it. So that's what we want. We want a value of -1. Now, let's say I lost it, like in this case. I just lost my access to the bump map. Don't worry about it. Just go back, click on the object, go back all the way to your tab for that material. Scroll down to geometry and click on the map again, and you'll get access to where the map was placed. Then go ahead and click one up again on that icon to get access to the bump map. And you should be able to control the attributes of that bump map under the 2D. Now, you can go ahead and play around with how deep you want that bump map to look. I'm going to go with 0.05. Seems like I just need a bit of an indentation on that. There you go. That looks pretty good. That looks clear. And remember, you have options. This is bump mapping because I'm using that black and white image. Remember, I have that black and white file that I just imported. But if I want to use, if I'm using a normal map, then I would make use of these two normal mapping options to create the texture. So with that done, let me go ahead and zoom out here for just a second. I think I'm good on this. Place this roughly on the screen. Focus on that and do a quick IPR to see what the end result is. And as you can see, I can see now the texturing, it doesn't look as plasticky as it did before, and that is because we have included that bump mapping that gives that impression of extra geometry for details on the fuselage. So I hope this clarifies the process once again on how to unwrap UVs in order to apply UV and in order to apply maps to complicated geometry.